as strike bakers in the industrial plants in East St. Louis, particularly in the aluminum ore plant. But really what it turned into, and this has been, I think, less well treated in the existing literature, is it turned into an effort to drive Black people out of East St. Louis entirely, to go into the neighborhoods and to burn down the houses. So it turned into an attack on Black domestic life, on Black women, on Black children, on the possibility of a Black future in East St. Louis. And then I followed that through the destruction for a different set of capitalist imperatives, more or less imperatives this time around real estate speculation. The destruction of a neighborhood called Mill Creek Valley, which that was torn down in 1956. It's an area of almost 500 acres. 20,000 people lived there. There were 800 institutions, business institutions, cultural institutions. And it was torn down more or less on a kind of a speculation that never came to fruition. So if you go to St. Louis today, there's still a terrific scar on the south side of the city where this neighborhood was, and where very little has come back. And then, I trace that forward to the Pruitt-Igoe housing project, which was blown up beginning in 1972. Again, another displacement that reflected a still different set of capitalist institutional imperatives, and finally out to North County, to Ferguson, where there's that population, that working class, working poor population, has found another foothold, and yet is now kind of being, I argue, rendered up for a final round of extraction, a final round of profit taking based on for-profit policing and payday loans and mass incarceration.
Let's talk about because you have these, just a sort of like blunt tools, I guess, in terms of just the destruction of these neighborhoods and violent attacks on where Black folk are living in St. Louis. Talk about the degree in which St. Louis is a segregated city, and segregated both in terms of you can see it in the context of race, but you can see it in all of the social, I guess, measures that we might take, demographic, class-wise, health-wise. Just give us some basic a sense of that disparity. And then I want to sort of just head into sort of the more legalistic mechanisms in which that segregation was created.
Yeah, so today, people in St. Louis talk about the Del Mar Divide, and when they talk about the Del Mar Divide, they're talking about a particular east-west traffic artery that runs more or less through the middle of the street. And the idea is that everything north of Del Mar is Black, and everything south of Del Mar is white. Now that's particularly south of Del Mar. That's not entirely true, but every single metric of social well-being that you can imagine, whether it's the rate of childhood asthma or the rate of broadband internet access, or whether it's income or lifespan or years in public education or vulnerability to traffic accidents or homicide or police shooting, you can track along that single line in St. Louis. And what you see north of Del Mar in North St. Louis today is, I think, to most people who haven't been there, is unfathomable. If you look from, if you get on Google Earth right now and you look at a map of St. Louis, a photographic map of St. Louis, North St. Louis will appear to be green. And the reason that it appears to be green is because there is so much vacancy, there's endemic vacancy and abandonment, and so many of the houses are torn down that the city is in many ways empty. To be in North St. Louis in the middle of the afternoon, the closest analog that I have is being in some neighborhoods in New Orleans in the months after Katrina. There's a sense of emptiness. There's nobody moving. You can look for 5 blocks along a straight street and not see any motion. And so it's something that sociologists call hypersegregation, which means that somebody in North St. Louis can go, an African American in North St. Louis can go for, a month without seeing a white person, right? Except for maybe a gas, somebody who owns a gas station, or maybe certainly police, right? And so it is a very, very segregated city. At the same time, you have a number of municipalities, among them 3 of the wealthiest municipalities in the entire United States, that are 95, 98% white in St. Louis County. So it's a highly segregated metropolitan area, and that has everything to do with the history and with the money that people have made off of racial animosity and the kind of social distancing that goes along with whiteness.
Is the metropolitan area of St. Louis, is it particularly balkanized in terms of the way that it's organized in terms of like charters and whatnot?
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's famously so. So St. Louis County, there are around 90 municipalities in St. Louis County. And I think people always point to the smallest municipality in St. Louis County is a little town called Champ that has 7 inhabitants. But it's not unusual to find a municipality of 400 or 500 people in St. Louis County. And the reason is that during the era of, I guess what you would call white flight and suburbanization, and I would want those things to be understood as processes that were subsidized by the federal government and enabled by the banks and real estate speculators. People would just set up a little town that was basically an excuse to have a zoning ordinance. And what the zoning ordinance did is it put limitations on the use of property within the city limits that would exclude, they were designed, intended, often explicit, often, sort of in the not nudge, wink way of racial exclusion to exclude African Americans. They did so through mechanisms that also excluded working class and poor white people. So, single family dwellings only, or minimum lot sizes. And so there are towns in St. Louis where you'll have a minimum lot size of an acre, right? So you're not allowed to build a house in this town unless you're building a house on an acre of land. Well, only wealthy people can do that. And so, in suburban St. Louis, people have in some of these towns have absurdly large yards. And so that's another artifact of the process by which the county was sort of chopped up into piecemeal municipalities that were basically excuses to have discriminatory zoning codes.
Yeah, I was just struck by the number of those municipalities within the context of a county. I mean, I'm relative to, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I just know that, relatively speaking, that just seems like an enormous, fivefold more Absolutely. Than we would get in Massachusetts. And all right, so let's talk a little bit about the and again, I think over the years we've certainly talked about these various mechanisms in which segregation was imposed, particularly as we go from in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, well into the 50s by official means, as it were. But they all seem to have been employed significantly in St. Louis. I mean, let's talk about some of these, some of the covenants, and also the backstopping of mortgages for white people as opposed to black people.
Right. So St. Louis in 1916 was one of the first cities in the United States to pass a housing segregation ordinance. But there was a Supreme Court decision, the Buchanan decision in 1917, which declared that housing segregation ordinances were unconstitutional. And so the tool of the trade for real estate speculators and white separatists came to be the restrictive covenant. What a restrictive covenant is it's a clause in the deed by which one person sells a house to another, or it's a sort of a neighborhood association often will have a clause written into a deed that says, well, you can buy this house now on the condition that you promise you will never sell the house to a Negro or Malay. And these kinds of restrictions were written into housing deeds all over the United States. And so, in Minneapolis, you can find them. You find them all over California. You find them in St. Louis. You can find them in almost every city in the United States. And that then created a two-tier housing market in St. Louis for a long time, for basically the years between 1917 and 1947. That was the mode of segregation. At the same time, or simultaneously, in the 1930s, I think 1934, the federal government created the Federal Housing Agency, which which provided loan guarantees to prospective home buyers. But because they were providing loan guarantees, they did a risk assessment on, whether or not they're guaranteeing loans that they believe are going to succeed or fail. And the way that they assessed risk was by the racial composition of the neighborhood in which the loan was being granted. And so this is where the phrase redlining comes from, is that there were certain neighborhoods that were majority black or majority non-white that were viewed as places that were dangerous to loan money for housing. So in the era of restrictive covenants, that began as a kind of a racial practice a racist practice on the part of the federal government that was turbocharged by the covenants. In 1947, in a case that came from St. Louis, Shelley versus Kramer, a housing rights case, very famous housing rights case, the Supreme Court ruled that restrictive covenants were unenforceable, legally unenforceable. One interesting footnote to that is that 3 of the 9 members of the court had to recuse themselves from the case because they themselves lived in covenanted neighborhoods, right? So after that, that's when you really reach you really enter the era of sort of nudge, wink white supremacy in suburbanization. And this is the very moment that the federal government is beginning to imagine and then construct the interstate highway system, which really begins in St. Louis. And they're doing so partly under the guidance of a guy called Harlan Bartholomew, who was you might call him the suburbanization czar of the United States. And so Bartholomew was an urban planner, extremely influential in the history of the United States, St. Louis-based, who was obsessed with automobiles and single-family suburban housing. And so St. Louis was really his laboratory. And so it's at that moment then that the practices, the white flight in St. Louis really takes off to the county and is subsidized still through these unequally allocated loan guarantees from the federal government and also by the GI Bill, which supports loan guarantees for white but not for black veterans generally. And so that's the era where the municipalities begin to sprout. And then even in cases where an individual African American is